Well, thank you all. I didn't expect that. I mean, I expected an introduction from Ethel Levy, right? She's famous for her eloquent introductions. More than that, though, she's been, a stalwart of Wellfleet and Truro and this Provincetown and this whole area. You probably know that. She and Robert Levy, they've just been rocks in sort of maintaining social consciousness here. Just taking a little bit of time out of people's vacation to make them think. And so they've, right, we don't think the rest of the time. And she's done a terrific job. And of course, we all miss Robert, who was, those of you who know him know, an extraordinary man. He used to sit there in a corner with earphones recording this for WOMR. So I'm really thankful to her. Thankful also to Elaine McElroy in the library. They make this place available to, I don't know if you make it available to anyone. You must have standards, right? But you sure make it available to all sorts of odd people. Yeah. So, thank you. And as Ethel said, this is what do you call it, Ethel? I don't know, a talk-along. Is this like a sing-along? Those things, yeah? And talk-along. Okay. So, does that mean that I should not say anything? No? I should say something. And then you will talk along. Or against. Right? In a spirit, right, of controversy, argument, contention, honest disagreement, right? Of course, I don't want it. But I'll take it. Maybe I'll just start very briefly. I know when a speaker says very briefly, you sort of sink into it, They never mean it, right? But very briefly, just say a few things about what I've been interested in for those of you who, never saw me before, never heard, just wandered in here, because you saw this crowd and the lights and, nothing else to do. So, I've been interested in history for a long time, and I became interested in teaching and writing a different kind of history than I learned in school. I suppose part of it came from my background, a kind of working class background. I don't want to draw too much on your sympathy. Nobody should cry at this point. But yes, and I went to work. I was a shipyard worker at the age of 18. Was working in a shipyard for 3 years. It wasn't a sociological experiment. I just, I had. That's the way it was with my families in our neighborhood and so on. You didn't go to college. You went to work at the age of 18. Then I enlisted in the Air Force, and I was a bombardier in the Air Force. A lot of people don't know that. In fact, most people don't know that. In fact, most people don't know anything about me. Most people don't know who I am, you see. But I was in the Air Force, and anyway, when I came out and sort of knocked around for a few years at different jobs and so on, my wife and I, both of us knocked around different jobs. We had kids and a couple. Sometimes I forget how many, but so I give them a round figure like a couple. And and then I went to college under the GI Bill. And began to study history in earnest, and then I realized, wow, I had been interested in labor history and labor struggles and was reading about it on my own, and I didn't see anything in the histories that I was getting in school or the books that were given to me. I didn't see anything about classes in American history. I thought you could write the history of the United States and use as your very first sentence, the history of this country is a history of class struggle. That's what I thought. But that didn't appear in my books, and that didn't appear in my classes. And it was all as if we were all one big family. This is America. And all the words, all the phrases, all the language was enveloping phrases. All of us together. Exxon and us. You know, the president and us. Where it's, the founding fathers, our fathers, right? As if the founding fathers were the fathers of black people, Indians, women, all these rich white, as if the founding fathers were a multicultural group. They weren't. But with all these phrases, the founding fathers, we the people of the United States, first words of the preamble of the Constitution, all enveloping, we're all together, all our interests are the same. And we use those phrases, the national interest. You see that all the time. Is this in the national interest? As if, yeah, our interests are the same as the interests of the Secretary of Defense, right? And no. Or national security, national defense, yes, all of that. All of those words, the things that Kurt Vonnegut called a grand falloon, like a great big bubble to envelop us, but a bubble which needs to be punctured in order to get to the reality inside. And so, I was interested in the absence of the class struggles in American history, which started right from the beginning, right from the very start, right from the very first Europeans who came to these shores, and they weren't all pilgrims with wearing those funny costumes and all equal, riding the Mayflower Compact. I remember it all seemed so democratic. And I wasn't told that there were very, very rich people right from the start and very poor people and indentured servants and slaves and, yeah, I didn't. So I was very interested in writing and teaching a kind of history which would illuminate what I thought was missing, and that was the existence of different class interests all through American history, and how there was a class interest represented in the Founding Fathers and in the Constitution and in all the legislation that followed from that time to this day, legislation which is written on behalf of a particular class, not the poor. Anyway, that's one aspect of my thinking which we can go into or ignore if you want to. But another aspect comes out of my experience in war as a bombardier, and I was in the good war, the best. And yet I came out of that at a certain point thinking war solves no fundamental problem. And that was the best. So you can imagine how I felt about what came afterward. Korea and Vietnam, right? And Grenada and Panama, and Yugoslavia and Iraq, right? So I've been, I came to the conclusion, yes, war and violence in general doesn't solve fundamental problems. My first teaching job was in Atlanta, Georgia. Taught at a black women's college in Atlanta, Georgia from 1956 to 1963. My wife and I, our kids, living in a black community, becoming involved in the civil rights movement. And that was the biggest learning experience of my life. Learned a lot. Well, one thing, I learned to look at American history from a black point of view, which had never been given to me in graduate school at Columbia. I mean, there weren't even African-American historians on my reading list in graduate school at Columbia up through the PhD, really. I had to discover Du Bois' Black Reconstruction by myself. And I had, as a teaching and living in a black community, to discover the black historians and the black scholars, and to learn about that point of view and how everything looked different from a black point of view, and then to extrapolate from that and think how history looked different to Native Americans. The Revolutionary War, wonderful War of Independence. Talk about good wars. Who has anything to say against the Revolutionary War? Who's going to stand up for the redcoats? Well, not me. But will I therefore stand up unequivocally for the leaders of the American Revolution? No, not necessarily. From a Native American point of view, the American Revolution was a disaster because it meant that now the British had set a line beyond which the colonists could move westward, and when the American Revolution was won and England was out, that line was gone, and now the colonists were free to move into Indian territory, and they moved and moved and moved and took and annihilated, and, well, you know the story. It's an ugly story. Maybe the most, and I'm going to finish with this, because I figure I could say everything that I know in 15 minutes, you see. The most important thing I learned, I think, from my experience in the South, being involved in the movement in Atlanta, in Albany, Georgia, Selma, Alabama, towns in Mississippi, and all of that. Most important thing I learned, I think, was about democracy. Was about what is the nature of democracy, because it was clear that all those formal institutions of government which had been presented to me in junior high school as democracy, you know, things they put on the blackboard, the 3 branches of government, executive, legislative, judicial, how neat a formula it was, how proud we were as kids to look at that on the blackboard and say, wow, checks and balances, that's good, you know, and nothing bad can happen because everybody will check one another if something bad happens. And of course, one of the things you learn in a movement, and especially it was very, very clear in the Southern movement and in the black movement, you could not depend on the formal branches of government. You could not depend on the Constitution. You could not depend on the President or Congress or the Supreme Court to achieve equality. People had to do it themselves, and that's exactly what happened in the South. And black people went out and they demonstrated and they protested and they were beaten and some of them were killed, and they aroused the nation and the world, really, to their situation, and things began to change. And that was democracy. As democracy happens when citizens, democracy doesn't come from the government. Democracy happens when citizens organize and get together and struggle for justice and begin to win things that are needed in order to have a decent society. So that's, I appreciate that enormous burst of applause. And that was planned. I mean, I set her, you know, I set her up too. I don't even know her. Do I? I don't know you, do I? I do. I did set you up. Okay. Anyway, that's all I have to say. So that should give you enough, right? You don't have to ask me or about things that I've spoken about. You can ask me about anything. And I may not know the answer, but you can ask, yes.
What do you read on a daily or weekly or monthly basis that gives you Howard Zinn that you can depend upon from the media?
What do I read in the media?
Yeah, on a daily basis.
On a daily basis, a weekly basis.
That you trust.
What are the periodicals that I trust? How about a list that I don't trust? Yeah, we know that, right? Yeah. Notice the suspense, because people know they're going to be let in on secret stuff, right? That they never heard of. But it's not secret, no. It's all almost available. I read The Nation. I read In These Times. I read The Progressive. I read Dollars and Cents. How many of you have heard of Dollars and Cents? Yeah. Dollars and Cents are very, very good. It's about economics, but it's about, it puts economics in ways that, well, you know how economics is put in ways that nobody understands. Now, this is something you can understand, and it's very, very good. For Latin American information, I get publications of the North American Council on Latin America, which comes, there are organizations that put out material on special subjects, like the Center for Defense Information will put out stuff on the military budget. The Children's Defense Fund will put things out on the rights of children. And so yeah, you have to look beyond, obviously, beyond Time and Newsweek, and certainly beyond the front pages of the New York Times. The back pages of the New York Times sometimes give you interesting information. Occasionally something on the front, you have to read it carefully. You have to read the mainstream press carefully. You'll get things in the Wall Street Journal, which nobody will pay attention to you, but you, looking, scrutinizing, will find things in the Wall Street Journal that the Wall Street Journal doesn't want you to notice. So there are, but I found there are things on the internet. Well, I shouldn't say the internet because I actually don't go into the internet, but everybody talks about the internet, so I thought I should too. Because, everybody pretends, when they talk about software and hardware and things like that. And I thought, hardware, you go to a store. And, but I do email. My son introduced me to email. And through email, how many of you do email? And, I mean, don't be ashamed if you don't do email, but email, I found, is not just a way of communicating with friends and so on. You get unsolicited things through email. You get things from people you never heard of, and you get very interesting stuff. Well, as an example, just 2 days ago, I got an email. Nobody ever heard of. Somebody sent to me something on email, which was a clipping from the Raleigh News and Observer in North Carolina. Now, I'm not a regular subscriber to the Raleigh News and Observer in North Carolina, but here was something clipping, and it was a very interesting thing. It was written by, it was a column, sort of an op-ed piece for the Raleigh News Observer, and written by sort of a man named Stan Goff, who worked for 20 years for the American military in various countries in Latin America and also in Somalia. He worked in Haiti, he worked in Guatemala, he worked in Colombia. And now he's not working for them anymore. And now he can spill the beans. And so he spilled the beans and he said, all this stuff, what is it all about anyway? He said, I know, I was there. He said, oh, it's all about economics and it's all about business profit. It's all about corporate connections. And it's all covered over with story like in Colombia, we're fighting against the drug war. Well, he knows. He was right involved in that. No, we're not fighting against the drug war. The money that is pouring in supposedly to fight the drug war is really fighting the guerrilla movement in Colombia and so on. This again and again in country after country. Actually corroborated to a certain extent, talk about the New York Times. There was something in the New York Times the other day, somebody may notice, about Operation Condor and about how, all this information began to come out about what the United States was doing to train and support paramilitary forces, torturers, and murderers in Latin American countries over a long period of years. So there's, and you have to, I suppose you have to read, stuff that, isn't in the mainstream, and and you have to go to the library. Very often people, young people say, well, where can I go for information? I say, and I'm not saying this for you, Elaine. This is not, even though the Wellfleet Library is a terrific resource, not only is it a terrific resource, it will get you books from anywhere. I'm just talking to somebody tonight. I know you don't believe when I say, I was just reading this the other day. I was just talking to somebody tonight. Think, do I only talk and listen to people so I can have something to say when I get up to speak? Yeah. But I was just talking to somebody tonight who said, a writer, who said she had gotten, you had gotten a whole bunch of stuff for her on a subject she didn't know anything about. You'd gotten it from various libraries and got her this pile of books. Anyway, the library. The library is one of the few places in our culture which is not yet controlled, by corporate wealth and power, and it has a lot of history, and you have to read history, and you won't get history in the newspapers, you won't get history on television, you have to go to the library in order to get history, and if you don't have history, it's as if you were born yesterday. And if you were born yesterday, you will believe anything that some authority tells you. You have no way of checking up on it, you know? The president will get up before the microphone and says, we have to bomb this. Well, sure, of course. The president says so. We must do it, right? He knows. Because you notice how smart presidents have been all through our history. You know, how every time they said we should bomb something, it was absolutely the right thing to do. But if you have no history, if you don't know the history of presidential lying, if you don't know the history of presidential deceptions, if you don't know the history of our wars and the enormous amount, you know, of folderol that accompanied wars, then you might believe. So the library is important. Yes?
The question I have for you is, we've seen, for example, we saw the shooting yesterday in L.A. We see that in Boston, the school system, they question this integration. We don't need it anymore. We don't need affirmative action. How do you explain that in a time when we know it's a joke, but it appears we have economic affluence, which you all know doesn't really trickle down? Why are people responding in this hate mannerisms? How do you interpret history, you know, an explanation? Because it appears that everything should be, the people should be calmer and understand and be more tolerant, although we understand they're really not. But how do you know, what's your interpretation?
You mean people should be calmer because the country is prosperous?
Well, no, I don't believe that. What I'm asking you is, why? No.
Oh, well.
It appears that, as you said, the president.
Well, then you really know. Then you know that behind the appearance of prosperity is an awful lot.
I agree with you, but I want
so then, you want me to say it? You know it. Yes. You think people will believe it more if I say it than if you say it. You know, very often questioners know more than you do about something, you see. And so what happens is they pretend they don't know a lot about this subject. And then you pretend you know a lot about this subject. So based on this double pretense, you have a very nice question and answer period. You see. But as you know, there's a lot of alienation in this country, right? And a lot of distress and a lot of envy. I mean, how can you not have envy and distress and neurosis when we have this enormous gap between the very rich and the very poor, a growing gap, and where we're beset, the whole culture beset with images of people living fantastic luxury, and other people, not just people in down below, but people in the middle classes struggling to keep their jobs, struggling to pay their kids' tuition. Well, even somebody who invests in stocks, right? Like that guy, right, who went berserk, the stock speculator, right? I mean, it's a very insecure kind of economic system we live under. Insecure, as I say, not just for the poor, but for the middle classes. And it's a situation where, well, as you know, this so-called prosperity. I mean, the president gets up there and he's glowing over with how wonderful, what an economic boom. And you know, all you have to do is walk through a city. Walk from one end of a city to the next, and you will see the class system in every city in this country. You will see people living very, very nicely, and you will see places and cities that look as if they've been through a war. And you know that the people who live in those places cannot possibly feel good about the world and about the society. And so much of this gets deflected into racial hatred, and people look for somebody to attack. And I guess I have to say something else about this. Whenever these incidents happen, and they happen so often, right? These shootings and these people going berserk in schoolhouses and post offices, and and everybody gets very indignant, and everybody asks, why and what shall we do about this, and how can we pinpoint these people? They always ask, how can we get a psychological profile of these people so we will know in advance who they are, you see? And what will you do then? You see? Because all of these people, after they do this, their neighbors all say, a really nice guy. You know, really. Didn't give me any trouble. Yes. But I want to say one more thing about that, and that is, you know, here we live in a culture in which the United States government possesses enormous weapons of violence and uses them, and then gets excited and indignant when some, you know, half-mad person goes berserk. You see, these people in Washington, they're not half-mad, right? Or are they? You see, wholly mad. I don't know, the definitions of madness, you know, are very, very strange. You know, somebody's mad if he just goes into a schoolroom and sprays people with bullets, but the President of the United States and Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and all those people up there are not mad when they drop cluster bombs that tear the legs off children. That's not, you know, they're not. When you live in a culture like that, and then what do you expect? So, you know, I think that's something we ought to think about if we want to start addressing, you know, the issue of violence. Yes.
What's wrong with a compassionate plutocracy?
A compassionate plutocracy. Show me one. Plutocracy means the people who have the wealth. Right, it's not an aristocracy, which is people who are better, right? But plutocracy, people who have the wealth, are going to be benign and run. No, even Plato, who wanted a platocracy, no. Even Plato, thought no. The people who run, and his wasn't a democracy, but he thought the people who run the thing should not have a lot of wealth. You see, even he understood that. You can't give people no. Forget it. Besides, we have a plutocracy, only it's not benevolent, right? And can't really expect those people to be benevolent until they're absolutely forced to. And that's what happens in history. Yes?
We've had a lot of experiments in government before Christ in ancient Greece and ancient Crete. And I'm wondering, I just finished reading Will and Ariel Durant's series, The Story of Civilization. And I'm wondering if those lessons of government are irrelevant to us today because of the size of our population and also the fact that we have the kinds of weaponry, our governments have the kind of weaponry that we do. What do you think about that?
I don't think anything in the past is irrelevant. That is, I think, we always can learn from the past. It's a question of whether you just, take, sort of mechanically things out of the past and plant them onto the present, or will you take selectively from the experience of the past, And we can learn things from ancient Greece. We'll learn, for one thing, that you can't call a place a democracy if most of the people are either slaves or women out of it, or people who don't have any power. It's not a democracy just because you've extended power to 500 people instead of everybody in the society. And you can learn a lot from ancient society. I mean, you can learn that you can have a society that is more liberal than any other. Like Athens was more liberal than Sparta, right? And so you can more democratic than Sparta. So you can learn a lot about that because Athens is more democratic than Sparta. But when they get involved in the Peloponnesian War during World War II, sometimes it was presented that way. It's like, it's like us, Athens, Hitler, Sparta, you see. But then they get involved in the war, and soon Athens is committing atrocities like the Spartans. And soon they've been corrupted, and soon the distinction between them becomes narrower and narrower. Well, so we can learn from that about how the relative liberalism at home doesn't translate into decency in treating other people in other cultures. So, I suppose Yeah, we can learn. Yes.
Do you see any hope, any programs, anything to make you believe that we will stop using war as our only means of conflict resolution?
Any hope that we will stop using war? We have to look hard, right? Yes, I do. But as I say, you have to look hard, and you have to be very hopeful. But I see it in what I think is, and how sure am I of this? A growing revulsion against war, evidence for which is the fact that governments have to disguise it more and more. Well, let's take the American government. And let's take the fact that if you took the United States at the time of the Vietnam War and you asked that question, right, that is towards the end of the Vietnam War, or even towards the middle of the Vietnam War, when the American people had turned against the war, and American people had turned not only against the war, but were thinking about the whole issue of war and indiscriminate warfare and bombing and so on. If at that point you had asked the question, the answer would be more hopeful, right? Because you'd say, well, you see, here for the first time, the American people have organized against a war. For the first time, we've had a movement, an anti-war movement, which actually had an effect on government policy. That's hopeful. For the first time, you have a large part of the population which is revolted by the things that our government is doing to another country. Now, what has happened since then? Since then, the government learned something from that. They were worried about that. And in fact, there was a sort of a flurry of activity, of consultations in high places about what will we do about what they call the Vietnam syndrome. You see, how will we get rid of the Vietnam syndrome? That is, people having the nerve to turn against a war, which is instigated by the higher-ups of the government. And they came to conclusions about that. And they came to conclusions that if we're going to have wars, and we've got to have wars, we've got to have interventions. We can't just let things happen in other places that we don't have control of. We don't, you know, it's the job of an empire, and we're an empire. It's a job of an empire to try to maintain control, influence in as many places as possible, you see. And if we're going to do that, we're probably going to have military interventions. But we learned from Vietnam, they're saying. And well, what we learned is that we'd better not have a prolonged intervention. If we're going to have interventions, they better be short. We'd better not give the public time to develop an antipathy towards the war. That's what happened in the Gulf War, right? Quick war. Also, minimize our casualties. We don't care about their casualties, right? Minimize our casualties. I remember at the end of the Gulf War, somebody, at the very end, like the last, the day after the end of the Gulf War, a reporter asked Colin Powell a question. He was giving the statistics on how many Americans had died in the Gulf War. Very low. In the hundreds, right? In the hundreds. Never heard of a war in which people die in the hundreds. In the hundreds. And then somebody asked him, oh, what about the dead on the other side? And Colin Powell said, that's none of my concern. And he was speaking for a lot of people up there in the brass. Unfortunately, he was speaking for a lot of Americans who have been conditioned not to think about what we do to other countries and only think about, what are our casualties. But the idea was, learn from Vietnam, have a short war, try to have as few casualties as possible, don't have too many body bags coming home, control the press, control the information, and end the war before there's a chance for a movement to develop. And I think now that Is that hopeful? Yes, no. I mean, it's hopeful in the sense that, so it's a tribute to the common sense and decency of people, that when they learn, if they get a clue to the fact that our good government is committing atrocities, they will rebel against it after they learn about it. It's a tribute to the good sense and decency of people. But the government, knowing that, tries to get around that and work with that. So yeah, that's good. I think in the recent war in Yugoslavia, again, do it fast. Again, no casualties on our side. Casualties on the other side, very little information about the casualties on the other side. I was getting emails from Yugoslavia. I didn't write to anybody in Yugoslavia. I was getting emails from people in Belgrade, people who were anti-Milosevic, people who had been part of the anti-Milosevic movement. And they were writing in indignation over the bombing of neighborhoods, the bombing of schools, the bombing, the so-called, it wasn't just a few little accidents, as they were reported in the press. That information was kept from the American people. The information about really on the human level what happened to Yugoslavia, to ordinary Yugoslavs, right? Whether they were, nobody knew, they're against, for, Milosevic, didn't matter. They were the ones who died, ordinary Yugoslavs. Information about what happened to them was kept from the American public. I mean, to this day, how many Americans has grasped the fact that we dropped, 1,000 cluster bombs, each of which has 200 bomblets. In other words, 200,000 of these things spread around Yugoslavia, and of which even the manufacturers estimated that 10% probably would not detonate. In other words, 10% would be lying there in the fields waiting to be picked up by anybody to explode. I mean, that's how there's one flash on television. It was one of the very few instances I saw of television covering what was happening to people in Yugoslavia, of a little kid in Yugoslavia lying on a hospital bed who had picked up one of these bombs and had lost both arms and an eye, you see. But that information, now, despite the paucity of information about that given to the American public, even the little bit of information that came across about accidental bombings of civilians, I believe there was evidence that was having an effect on public opinion. Even the public opinion polls showed that there was a lowering support for the bombing as it went on. And to me, that's you may say I'm really grasping for hopeful signs. But to me, yes, that was a sign, a hopeful sign that when people learn that something terrible is being done, they will care, and when they begin to show they care, the government may have to take notice, and let's work out an end to this. Yes, a question there? Oh.
I just have two questions, sir.
Okay.
The first one is, since you were speaking of democracy, it's with respect to democracy.
Yeah.
I wanted to know, what's your position about the United Nations? Don't you think that it is falling back to the position of the League of Nations? If some nation can try to solve some conflict independently to that organization. And the second question is about economics. It's what do you think about, because in your book I saw that the big corporations from 1950 to 1965, the American corporation invested, for example, in Europe, $8.1 billion and had for benefit 5.5 billion. Whereas in Africa, they invested $5.2 billion and they had $14.1 billion. And that was just right after the colonization. We didn't have the neoliberal, this huge corporation, Bill Clinton speaking of an open market, let everything going smoothly. How can these emerging nations can emerge in this climate? Thank you.
Wow. thanks for those statistics. You got them from my book. I'm very impressed with my book. I recognize those statistics, actually, but I could never have brought them up. But what those statistics showed is how much more profit there was in investing in third world countries. And in Latin America and Africa, the rate of profit was much, much higher than investing in European countries or Canada and so on. And, and that's still, that's still true. And of course, what the investment, which they very often tout as well, we're doing good for these people, but you can measure how much good is being done by our economic arrangements with third world countries. You can measure that by what is happening to the income of people in third world countries, and how I talked about everybody knows about the growing gap in the United States between the very rich and the poor, or not even just the poor, between the very rich and the working people in the United States. On the world scale, the gap is even greater. On the world scale, the gap is much wider and growing faster. I mean, just between like 1885 and historians miss a century or two. Well, it doesn't matter, between about something like 1983 and 1995. I mean, the gap had started as, the average income in the richest country in the world was about 75 times the average income in the poorest country in the world. But a decade or so later, the average income in the richest country in the world was about 240 times what it was in the poorest country in the world. The gap, and so obviously all the stuff that the World Bank is doing, all the stuff the International Monetary Fund is doing, all the things that the World Trade Organization is doing, are not doing anything to alleviate poverty, sickness in the third world. That's a big job. As soon as you get, it's hard enough to talk about social movements on the national level and changing policy on the national level, changing, international policy, changing the policy of the IMF. Well, they have a meeting, a World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle, and again, they're going to make their plans. But a ray of hope, there's going to be a huge counter demonstration against that by people who are aware of how trade policy has adversely affected people in third world countries. But this brings us to, what about the UN? Is the UN going to do anything about this? And as you said, is the UN becoming more like the League of Nations? Well, not that bad, but it's certainly true that, the UN has always been dominated by the major powers. It's never been a true United Nations. There's never been equality among the nations in the UN. You just look at the Security Council and the Big Five, and the Security Council makes the important decisions about war and peace, and here are the Big Five nations, and they have any one of them has a veto power. And of course the United States, the big nations wanted it. Russia wanted it, the United States wanted it, and now, lately, with what happened in Yugoslavia, whatever power and prestige the United Nations had before this, which was not enormous, suffered a very, very great blow because the UN was totally bypassed. And in the waging of war in Yugoslavia, it was bypassed because the United States would not be able to get the five powers to agree that we should go ahead and bomb. And so, well, there's an old story, it doesn't matter what's written, it doesn't matter what the law is, it doesn't matter what the charters are, it doesn't matter the promises that are made. What matters is who has the power. And the United States had the power to say, forget about the UN. The UN is not going to do it. We'll do it ourselves. Ourselves means NATO. NATO means the United States, because the United States is the dominant power in NATO. So, so NATO carries on this, and the UN is bypassed, and the charter of and the rules of the Security Council about when you can go to war are just simply ignored. Yes.
We have an election coming up.
An election coming up.
Presidential election.
Presidential election.
Yeah. Okay.
I've heard.
Is there anything that people can do to change the direction of the country?
Change the direction of the country. Not vote for either the Republicans or the Democrats. That is not going to change the direction of the country. I mean, try to figure out when is the last time electing either a Democrat or a Republican changed the direction of the country in any significant and good way. You know, maybe the last time was 1932 or 1936, right? But now, you know, you elect Clinton to change the direction of the country? No, and then we get a Republican legislation. You know, we get bipartisanship. I mean, we always had bipartisanship in foreign policy. Now we have bipartisanship in domestic policy, too. Now Republicans and Democrats agree on doing away with the New Deal, you know, aid to families with dependent children. Now Republicans and Democrats agree on a crime bill to build more prisons and have more capital punishment. You know, Republicans and Democrats agree on all of these things. So, no, the best thing we can do, and I know it's a kind of helpless thing. Here we are. We're living in a political system which is dominated by two major parties, and it's very, very, very hard for a third party to break in. And so what do? I think it's very important to think in the long run. If you only think in the short run, you'll think Gore is 1/2 degree better than Bush. And so let's, you know, no, because that kind of continuous thinking in the short run produces this endless cycle of bipartisanship, which doesn't bring about any real change in the country. And I think, you know, the best thing we can do is start to join organizations and form organizations which are critical of the policies of both major parties, which put up independent candidates in different parts of the country, which maybe you might support a Democrat here or there, maybe even a Republican here or there, if they have not gone along with a bipartisan consensus. You know, there were people in Congress who didn't go along with a change in the welfare legislation, and a few who didn't go along with the bombing of Yugoslavia. But I think, thinking in the long term, we need to create a new independent political force in this country. And the most important thing is not a force based on politics and the electoral system, because the electoral system has drained an enormous amount of political energy from people who should be working on social movements. Because if you have a powerful enough social movement, if you have a powerful labor movement, a women's movement, movement of people of color, movement of this, if you have a powerful enough movement, it won't matter whether there's a Republican or a Democrat in office, they will have to respond to this movement. Even under Republican governments, we got some legislation, environmental, you know, disability, and so on, because there were movements that pushed them. So, no, the two major parties, forget it. Yes.
You've been a teacher for many years. I was at Boston University years ago when you were teaching, and my question is, you've written a textbook and it's a revisionist methodology. Do you have any words, any advice for teachers or reflections on your own career as a teacher?
Word of advice for teachers. Reflections on my career as a teacher. Well, I just realized it was a career. Okay. Most important advice I have for teachers is take risks. I know that's a dangerous thing to say. I don't want to tell you to take too many risks and immediately get fired. Delay it for a while, you see. But take risks in the sense of don't be intimidated by the curriculum. Don't be intimidated by the textbooks that the department insists that you use. If you don't like the reading material that's handed down, find reading material that you think your students should have and sneak it to them. When my book of People's History first came out, it seems a little more respectable today for some reason, which makes me nervous. But when it first came out, it was sort of looked upon, wow, radical history, this sort of thing. And teachers in high schools, teachers in colleges have a lot more leeway, although college teachers can be intimidated very easily. But teachers in high schools very often don't have the control over the textbooks they assign to their students. And so I would get letters from teachers around the country say, I got into trouble using your book. What happened is high school teachers, they weren't allowed to use my book officially. They would Xerox pages from my book, chapters from my book, and hand it out in the dark to students, And now, actually, it's, as I say, I'm a little worried about this, but now, actually, I find whole departments and schools, using officially my book. But yeah, use the materials that you really want to use. Teach the way you want to teach. Don't be bound by what the syllabus says or anything like that. I know that's troublesome because you very often are bound in a sense, and they're trying to bind teachers more and more by giving them standardized, you have to prepare kids for standardized tests and so on. That makes it more difficult. But I think it's wrong to succumb to that completely. You may have to compromise and do a little of the stuff that they expect you to do to prepare your students. But after all, we don't want to prepare our students just to pass exams and get high scores. We want to prepare our students to be citizens of the world, right? We don't want to just reproduce another generation of young people who are going to create a world which imitates the world that we have lived in the 20th century. And if we're going to do that, if we're going to produce a new generation of young people, then we have to break away from old ideas and old readings and so on. And that means, yes, taking risks, and only each individual person can decide for himself or herself, how to play this kind of guerrilla warfare with the educational system.
I just want to follow up on that question. I think I'm doing the risk-taking. I am Xeroxing shamelessly your book and handing it out. I'm teaching 7th and 8th graders, predominantly white, alternative school. My question is, the curriculum, when we're teaching history and the truth of history, we're teaching facing history, we followed the war in Kosovo last year, we followed Rwanda, also the genocide there, and the Holocaust and the Middle Passage. What happens to me, and where I get into trouble, is that the parents object that the curriculum is very grim and very dark. Of course it is. And the students, I notice, as when you do the myth, deconstructing the myths that they've had in the past, they also take on a kind of depression, and their spirit. My question is, how do you keep the spirit to make a different world, and at the same time teach them the truth of these very grave, very dark truths when they're that young and impressionable, which I think is the perfect time for it. But that's the trouble that I get into.
Ooh.
I need help.
No, that's a very good question, because it's true that when you begin to take a critical look at society, right? We begin to tell what Columbus really was like, right? And you begin to tell, say, Theodore Roosevelt was not a great hero, right? He was a racist, and a guy who, congratulated generals for committing massacres in the Philippines, and he should be taken off Mount Rushmore immediately, you see, with a hammer and chisel, you see. but it's all, you're right, you know, it's all negative, and wow, things are so bad, right? But what I find the antidote to that, I think, and I think the way to balance this rightly dark, critical picture of war and governments and the way things have been, the way to balance that is the stories of people who have fought against this. You know, while you're talking about Columbus, talk about Las Casas. Talk about this priest who was a whistleblower, who denounced what was going on, who wrote about it, you know, wrote volume and volume about the things that were going on. Yeah, give people the crucible to read, so when they deal with the terrible things about the witchcraft trials, they say, here's an example of courage. You know, here's John Proctor, and here are these people who stand up against this. And what about the people who struggled for better conditions? And sure, it's a grim picture of the rise of the industrial system in the United States, and the factories and the long hours and the killing of workers who resisted. But what about those girls who went to work in the New England mills and who went out on strike in the 1830s and who put out newspapers and who, you know, there's, I mean, our history is full of people who did marvelous things in resistance. And think of the anti-war resistors. Think of the deserters, the Irish immigrants who looked up in the Mexican War and said, "What are we doing here?" and deserted and formed their own brigade, the St. Patrick's Brigade, and became known as the San Patricio Battalion. And I mean, there were anti-war people who fought against war, who were heroic people. And you know, I think of wonderful. Well, I think of Emma Goldman and the early feminists and anarchists and anti-war people, and there's a whole. I mean, I remember once, somebody. It was during the bicentennial, not bicentennial, quincentennial. I wasn't alive during the bicentennial of Columbus. I swear. But the quincentennial, right, in 1992, and I was on a forum about Columbus, and there was this man with me who was the chair of the New Jersey Committee for Columbus, right? and so we obviously, had differences about Columbus. But after it, he approached me, very nice person, and said, but, he said, "You don't understand." He said, "I'm an Italian-American. We need Columbus. We need our heroes." I said, "No, you don't need him. You have Joe DiMaggio. For all of these people we take down, who we expose as, as racists and warriors and sexists and all those people, there are other people who always fought heroically, and you think of the people in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, and I mean, more than we, and it's those stories, I think, that are inspiring for young people, for students." Yes?
I think it's very important, Howard, just to kind of pursue the work you did in people's history, to say that it's not just history, but that's still going on now. I mean, you don't have to just look at Emma Goldman or Harriet Tubman, but the work that Peace Work does, that I know that you work with, and that there are people you can bring into the classroom today that can talk about, Elaine Bernard that was here, and Jonathan Fine that was here, and people that we hear. You can, because a lot of the young people need to have, a live example, right? I mean, not to say for all of us that are getting gray hair are dead, but the sense that also young people are involved in social change movements today. Yeah. And it's not that history has just passed them by, not giving them the opportunity to be in the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, but they need to create and know that they have their own way of making this happen. And Candace's question, I think, is interesting in that, and that is, where examples of that today that people can learn about and hook into. are very important for the future.
That's a very, very important point. And when I was teaching, I would always try to bring into my classes people who are working on something, community activists. And so people could see examples, people who are working, I'd bring in somebody who was an ex-prisoner working with the American Friends Service Committee to do something about the prison system. And they'd never encountered somebody like that before. Bring in somebody who was working, with, the choice, the whole, women in the movement, and I think that's very, very important to bring in. Get yourself out of the classroom for a while, and it'll save you a lot of work, right? Teachers are always looking to bring somebody else in. They let them do the work, but they're better, because they're really out there doing things, and it's a very good example for young people. Yes.
Here we are in the library, and you're talking about corporate manipulation, but there is something else that has always happened in this country, and here we had a manifestation of it in Kansas yesterday, the Kansas State Legislature, acting to restrict the teaching of evolution and to put an imprimatur on legitimacy of creationism, and to limit, if you please, history, man's history, to the last 8,000 years, as if there was nothing else before, because their Bible says it's so. So I have a question that really troubles me, as a virtuous secularist, you understand. How in a time when there's so much confusion and frustration and consternation and the growth of cults, the bad things are cults, more or less. How do we distinguish between cults, or how would you distinguish between cults and what is thought of as organized religion? That's the good part. When it was essentially organized religious bodies that challenged the teaching of evolution in Arkansas, and it took a U.S. district judge to reject that. One shudders at the capriciousness of a judicial appointment. It could have been a different kind of a judge. Maybe the compassionate conservative would appoint a different kind of judge, or maybe Gore would. But how would you distinguish in terms of continuing to try to protect what we have in libraries and what we have innately in teachers and schools and books and so on? This right of dissent and of examination. And would you have any comment about it, any kind of definition of a cult as against so-called organized religion? Because I swear I don't know where one stops and the other begins.
Oh, well, I hardly know where anything stops and anything begins. And I certainly don't know where cults stop and organized religion begins. But after all, that distinction is not as important to me, as the distinction between religious people who sort of maintain mysticism and stand in the way of social justice, and those people, whether in the church or outside the church, but those religious people, who have set as a life goal the ideals of peace and social justice. Because the church, religion, they've always been split along lines of maintaining things as they are, or diverting attention from the way things as they are, and paying attention to the real world and doing something about it. I mean, I developed a great respect for for religious people who came down to the South to become involved in the anti-war movement, and for religious people who already were in the South, and ministers who gave their churches over to meetings of the civil rights movement, and to people in the anti-war movement, you know, the Catholic anti-war movement, and the Berrigans, and Liz McAllister, and those people who, created a connection between their spiritual life and the indignation they felt about the injustices of the world. Those are the distinctions that seem to me important, and all we can do is try to support one against the other. I'm looking at my watch because I promised somebody that it would end at a reasonable time. Yes.
I find you disturbing and agitating, and for that I thank you. And I thank also the Psychic Committee. I don't recognize many faces tonight, but there were 5 other occasions for us to be together, to meet with equally exciting speakers, and hopefully we'll see each other next year. Ethel Levy, in the brief time I've known her, a woman who was responsible for all of this wonderful summer, has a profound belief in the indomitable spirit of man, that man shall prevail. I don't have her optimism. I see so much greed and corruption and total disregard for the millions of the helpless among us. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. There's so much sickness. Kids go to bed hungry. It's a disturbing situation. And the more I think about it, the more frustrating I become. And as a result, I tend my little garden. I say, well, I can take care of this weed. What advice would you have for people like me who feel so frustrated, so helpless in the face of what we conceive to be in an incurable situation? How do I cut out this spiritual cancer?
That's a big one. But it's a very, very important question, because what you said, I think, represents the feeling of an awful, awful lot of people. So many of my friends are depressed. Sometimes I think it's because they're my friends. But no, it's probably the state of the world, you see, which it's, you can try to ignore it. People take drugs and turn to alcohol, right? All sorts of ways people try to ignore what's going on in the world. But I find that, the healthiest thing is to get together with other people and work. You talk about tending your garden. Yes, I assume you mean it sort of metaphorically. That is, there are little gardens of social action that exist all over this country. There's an amazing number of people in this country. I travel around a lot. Whatever town I go to, however small, there's always a group of people who gather in rooms and think about the injustices and try to do something about it. I would guess there are millions of people in this country. See, the problem is we don't know about them because the media doesn't tell us. The media doesn't tell us the good news. It tells us the bad news. It tells us what the president is doing. It doesn't tell us what this group in Duluth, Minnesota is doing. I go to speak in Duluth, Minnesota, and there are 16 tables in the back of the room representing 16 different organizations that are, I didn't make this up. There really is a Duluth, Minnesota. They don't know there's a Wellfleet, Massachusetts. But we know there's a Duluth, Minnesota. And wherever, during the Gulf War, I go to Texas City, Texas, and there are 500 people, and they're all against the war. And they're war veterans and oil workers and so on. And all over this country, there are groups of people who care, who are working, They're doing little things. You don't know what they're doing because the media don't tell us. And because this is the typical situation in this country, I suppose in any country, in between great social upheavals. Really. You look, the 1960s was a time of social upheaval, a time you wouldn't say in the midst of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, nobody's doing anything about this or that. You wouldn't say that. But if you looked at the country in 1959, you'd say, well, what's going on here? Terrible things are going on and nobody's doing anything. But the fact is, beneath the surface of apparent complacency and apparent disregard for what's going on in the world, beneath that surface, people have common sense and people have care about what is happening to other people in the world. And it means you have to have the kind of faith that if you continue to do little things with even little groups of people of like mind, that at some point in history, and you don't never know when, that's just it, you never know when, but if things really are bad, you see, and you have confidence that when people learn things are bad, they will do something about them, that they will first feel it before they do something. They will feel it even before they say anything about it. If you have confidence that beneath the surface, all that is going on, and that if you keep working, and if everybody keeps working, and if this multiplies, and that at some point, we've seen in history, we've seen it in the labor movement, we've seen it in the civil rights movement, in the anti-war movement, the women's movement. We've seen people working quietly under the surface for long periods of time and nothing happening. And then, at a certain point, unpredictably, something happens. And therefore, we have to have the faith, you see, that, if you just keep at it, if you just persist, if you don't give up, if you have a certain patience and a certain confidence in people, that, yes, something will come of this. When people started in the civil rights movement, imagine people black people in Mississippi and Alabama, and imagining that they're going to turn over things in Alabama and Mississippi where they had no power and no wealth, where everything was against them. I mean, the police, the state machinery, the local sheriff, and even the federal government was standing aside and not doing anything. And think of the movement against the war in Vietnam, and think it starting with small rallies here and there. How can you stop a war against this giant military machine? But it built and built. And just people persisted. And then there's this thing to hold on to, I think, that you don't know when things will change, and you don't know when a new social movement will come into being, and when something will happen. Although we've seen in other countries extraordinary things happen, right? Where it seemed like nothing would happen, totalitarian states, and suddenly 1 million people are in the streets and the Berlin Wall is down, right? Or a government has been toppled here, or Franco is gone and Spain is a little different, or Pinochet is gone and Chile is a little different. Let's not ask for too much, you see. But I think through all of this, there's one very important thing that sustains me and sustains a lot of people I know, is that whatever the outcome, which you can't predict, being in the struggle, doing something, makes you feel alive. It makes you feel it's worthwhile, and makes life worth living, and makes you feel a lot better than if you were just depressed about the state of the world and doing nothing. Well, yeah.
I wonder, for the interest of this man and maybe everybody, to talk about a remarkable case in point at this time, the School of the Americas.
Yes.
And that little struggle that Roy Bourgeois has kept going for 15 years, and now the numbers of people, the people's movement around closing the School of the Americas has led to thousands of people going down to Fort Benning. There'll be another 5,000 or more perhaps in November, and hundreds of Congress people who are now voting down the school. I mean, this is extraordinary. I would like you to talk about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing about how you all know about the School of the Americas, which is sometimes called the School of Assassins. You know, this school that the United States ran, first it ran it in Panama, right? But then it moved to Fort Benning, Georgia. But it's a school where the United States trained military and police forces in Latin American countries, many of whom turned out later, you know, well, many of them were at the time, but many of them ended up, you know, in military hunters and as torturers and as, you know, it's a part of military dictatorships in various parts of Latin America. And information about that has, you know, been coming out little by little by little, you know, horrendous information. But there's another example where as information comes out and more people know about it, it becomes harder to sustain something bad. And so, as you say, more and more congressmen each year vote against maintaining the School of the Americas. And all these thousands of people have gone down to Fort Benning, Georgia. Who wants to go to Fort Benning, Georgia? Thousands of people have gone down to Fort Benning, Georgia and gotten arrested and protesting against this. But finally, years and years and years, it's building up. I remember when the House Committee on Un-American Activities existed. And 2 congressmen would vote against the perpetuation of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And then 20 congressmen. And then as more and more people became aroused against, you know, this nonsense that was going on, McCarthyism and pre-McCarthyism and post-McCarthyism and all of that, the numbers grew until finally it was voted out, disappeared. And it's possible, yeah, for things to happen, things to change. And there are lots of examples like that. Look at the campaign against landmines, which has, you know, grown and grown and grown. Not sufficiently for the United States to agree to ban landmines, but, you know, maybe at some point that will happen. Yes?
You say that the School of Americas might close, and I believe it will. But what about the satellite school in Columbia and others?
Oh, well, you're giving us small work, huh? I don't know. That will take, you know, first of all, how many people know about the satellite school in Columbia? You'll have to spread the word. Other people have to spread the word. But, you know, one thing at a time. Yes.
Would you speak about campaign financing? George W. seems to be the anointed Republican candidate, not because of his accomplishments, not because of his ideas, as much as because of his $30 million campaign fund. Lamar Alexander, conversely, seems to be very close to being out of the campaign, again, not because of his ideas or his lack of accomplishment, but rather because he's only got apparently $90,000 in his campaign coffers at this point. Is this a serious problem for the United States? Would you speak about campaign finance reform?
Well, it's a serious problem for the United States that money dictates politics, and that both parties, Republicans and Democrats, are dependent on huge corporate contributions. And in recent years, the Democrats have come closer to the Republicans in getting huge amounts of corporate support. You know, the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats, the Republicans will have a dinner where you have to pay $400,000 to be at the dinner. The Democrats are more liberal. You only have to pay $300,000 to come to the dinner. You know, obviously a dinner for working people. And so no, it's a serious, the control of elections by money is sort of a very serious problem. And I mean, to the extent that it's possible to change campaign finance laws, sure, I think people should work on that. But I don't think people should have illusions about what a crucial effect laws will have on the reality of corporate power. Because, you know, I mean, you can pass reform laws, and and it's a good idea to do it, but I don't see it as some people do as the way to do away with the problem, of money in politics, big money in big politics, and it's we're going to have to substitute the organizing of people for the organizing of money. We're going to have to match the accumulation of money with the accumulation of people by organizing. And I think that is a crucial way to try to do something about the power of money in elections. Well, yes.
Time calls for the abolition of nuclear weapons.
Calls for the abolition of nuclear weapons.
Do you think this is an attainable goal?
An attainable goal.
Or feasible?
Feasible. Let's find another word. Useful goal. It's a. I think it's a useful goal because it points to the stupidity of the maintenance of nuclear arsenals in the world. Whether it's attainable or not, it's not a question that's even worth asking. Because you're talking about something absolute, the abolition of nuclear weapons. But I think it's a goal worth striving for. Like we strive for a lot of goals. We have no idea whether they will be attained or not, but they're certainly worth working for. And certainly the United States, as the leading nuclear power in the world, has to lead the way. And the United States has not led the way. Talking again about Star Wars, and of course the maintenance of this huge military budget. I mean, if there's any sort of single issue around which it may be possible to create a new social movement in this country, it is about what do we do with the enormous wealth that this country has, which is 270 billion or whatever, soon it'll be more than that, 2 billion a year wasted on the military budget, an enormous amount of money pouring up into the upper classes, huge amount, this very, very wealthy country spending its money on military junk and on the luxuries of the rich, while very, very fundamental human needs go unmet. And it seems to me the abolition of nuclear weapons is part of what I see as a larger campaign to start to think about using the great wealth of this country in a rational and humane way. And that means the government, that means forgetting about this nonsense of privatization and leave it to the beneficence of corporations to do things, and or as talking against big government, as both parties have done, as Clinton's succumbed to that, or maybe he didn't have to go far to succumb to it in his last presidential campaign when he said, the era of big government is over. No, government is going to have to do things that private enterprise will not do. Private enterprise will not assure health care for every American. Private enterprise will not assure decent housing for every American. Private enterprise will not assure a decent income for every American. They may pay minimum wages, but they won't. That's not enough to keep a family really alive. We're going to have to go back to an idea which became important in the days of the New Deal, and the idea became accepted because then we were in the throes of an obvious depression, and here we're only in the midst of a kind of undercurrent of sickness in the economy and in the society. But yes, the New Deal understood that if private enterprise wasn't taking care of people, the government might have to supply jobs, the government might have to subsidize housing, the government might have to take care of people who were in need, but we'd have to have a New Deal on a much larger scale to utilize the great wealth of this country to do away with poverty and do away with, 1/4 of all the children in this country live in poverty. And there's the Dow Jones average, and there are the figures on infant mortality, and child poverty. And there, as a maybe one of the most acute examples of a sickness in society, almost 2 million people in prison. Something is wrong there. And I remember seeing a couple of years ago that they did a study, and they found that 70% of the people in prison in New York State came from 8 neighborhoods in New York, the 8 poorest, most miserable, most desperate neighborhoods. That would have to be addressed by utilization of the wealth of this country for humane purposes. We have time for one more question. Okay.
I was wondering if you could say something about the politics of academia. I was radicalized by my history professors some 30-something years ago, and as I look at my children's experience and as I take my children on the college tours and so on, I find it very disturbing when I ask how many women and teachers of color on the faculty, that information isn't available. When these admissions people can quote, from here to tomorrow, how many engineers there are and so on and so forth, it feels like the corporate, world has taken over, and that political activity in academia, and I mean by the professors, I'm not talking about where's the student movement, but really what are the options for students nowadays to be getting the kind of education that some of us got in the past. And I'm confused because it's my colleagues who are doing the teaching. I mean, my friends, right, who are teaching, right?
She finds the situation in academe not a very happy one. How's that for an understatement? And thinking of her kids going to college in London, where's the movement? Where's the where are the things going on? Where are the good programs? And it doesn't find any interest in whether there were how many women are in the faculty and how many people of color in the faculty. And well, because you've been talking to admissions officers, right? You never talk to an admissions officer when you want to be admitted to college. No, I mean administrators in general. And you can't depend on faculty in general. Never have been able to depend on faculty to lead movements for change. Faculty generally respond to what students do. Students usually are the leaders. And there are, as you said, there are student movements that talk about changing the nature of faculties. There was this thing that happened in Berkeley, a remarkable thing, where they were going to do away with a multicultural program at the University of California, Berkeley. And these students organized, and they demonstrated, and they occupied the president's office, and several of them went on a hunger strike. And things got very, very tense, and the police, of course, were called in, but they held out, and they wouldn't give in. And finally, the chancellor, they won. The program was saved. A certain number of people, more faculty, people of color, and women were hired. What I'm saying is, it's going to take a lot of organization, agitation. I expect the students will probably be the ones to lead. The important thing for faculty is to support them. And there are a lot of faculty around who came out of the 60s, and who might recall some things, and then might support the students as they did back then, So thank you for coming. Yeah, and Yeah. And again, thank Ethel Levy for her incredible work.